Upstream and downstream. So we've talked about this before, and the idea that we can basically map on anything we want to do in alcohol and drug policy to the upstream downstream model. Upstream things, actions, programs will tend to have the largest area of effect. They tend to be policies. Downstream actions tend to be very specific, focusing on use or even the prevention of reuse. So essentially someone who's already diagnosed with a dependence syndrome, they've gone through treatment, and you're trying to prevent a reoccurrence of that dependence. But we can also map different policies into the same model. So policies in general are an upstream intervention. But within that policy category, we can have upstream, midstream, and downstream policies depending on where their focus is. So if we have a primary prevention policy, so a very upstream policy, these are policies intended to prevent a risk factor of disease from forming. So preventing exposure to marketing, for instance, preventing earlier initiation of alcohol or tobacco or drug use. Those would be primary prevention policies. Secondary prevention policies would essentially be accepting that someone already has a risk factor, and now you're trying to prevent or limit their use of a product. So, for instance, a teenager may have initiated alcohol use at a very young age, but now you're trying to implement a policy or program so that they don't become a regular heavy user or a regular binge drinker while they're in college. And then finally, you have these tertiary prevention policies where someone may have already had the disease in question, they had a substance use disorder, they are a current binge drinker or they're a current smoker, and now you're trying to prevent a reoccurrence. So you're trying to either get them to quit what they're doing, and if they have quit, you're trying to make sure they don't start up their substance use again. There are many, many alcohol and drug policy options out there, and this is really not a complete list. If I put a complete list there, the font would probably be so small it wouldn't be readable. But let's just highlight where these might fit on that upstream-downstream model. So things like taxes and price controls, regulating where certain substances are available, limiting what products, what pharmaceutical drugs can be sold and by whom and where are upstream options. They're preventing the substance from being marketed, and they're preventing the substance from even being available to be consumed by at least some segment of the population. So if we relate it back to this, and regulating advertising is in there too. So essentially saying the risk factor for disease is actually the availability of the product, because you can't use a product without it being available. So let's limit its exposure in the neighborhood of our concern in the community. Midstream options, again, they're trying to prevent the use from occurring or prevent heavy use from occurring. So now you're talking more drug prevention programs, mass media campaigns. Essentially, the risk factors here are you're aware of the use, you've already used the substance maybe once. So now you're trying to do things to make it harder to use the product more, or you're trying to convince people using health promotion techniques to not use the substance more. Midstream options also include things like altering the context of where substance use occurs, which is kind of a harm reduction approach, which we'll talk about in another video. Essentially, you're accepting that the substance use will occur, even hazardous substance use, but you want to make sure that it's done in a safe environment so there's no dangerous consequences of use or no unnecessary negative consequences of said use. And then your downstream policies, your downstream programs are really focusing on treatment or punishment from use. So a lot of things in terms of promoting different types of treatment, whether that's in the community or one-on-one settings. Sometimes you can say, in some instances, you're increasing the penalties for drug possession and use, or using that as a deterrent for people to use again or even the first time. But then other times you're decreasing the penalties depending on what you want to do. That's kind of the movement of the recreational marijuana right now. But everything that these have in common, is that they're either promoting treatment, they're promoting punishment of use, or they're trying to prevent the secondary consequences of use. So again, that would be the DWI countermeasures. They're already drinking to get drunk. Now we're just trying to make sure that those those consequences of use, those downstream impacts of heavy alcohol use, don't actually occur. So here's how some of them kind of fit into that model. So these upstream policies, these primary prevention policies, include things like taxes and marketing restrictions, make it harder to buy a substance, making it harder to even know a new product is available. But it's also regulating the industries themselves, and this is primarily for tobacco, alcohol, and the pharmaceutical industry, making it harder for them to sell, making it harder for them to innovate in some cases. This is particularly true with tobacco here in the United States and elsewhere, where the regulatory bodies, which would be the Food and Drug Administration in the US, actually have control of what compounds and what flavorings can actually go into a cigarette. They can even regulate the amount of nicotine in a cigarette should they choose to do so. Now, there would definitely be a court case involved, but those regulations are in place and they do have the power to do that. Those secondary prevention policies, again, those are like the mass media campaigns, making sure if use does occur, it occurs in a safe environment. And then those tertiary prevention policies, those are really treatment options or penalties for use or reducing the consequences of use. So you're already accepting that heavy substance use will occur, you want it to do it in a more safe way. So again, it's more of a harm reduction approach. And this idea of upstream, downstream does fit within the epidemiological cascade, which we talked about in a previous video. So if you're thinking about where diseases occur from a corporate-induced disease model, the diseases themselves are very, very downstream. They're at the bottom of the waterfall. They're at the bottom of the river. They're going out into the ocean. And if you can't see my hands, but I'm actually pushing them out into the ocean myself. But when you talk about the politics behind it, the policies behind it, those decisions that are being made at the corporate level that might increase substance use at a midstream level and increase disease outcomes at a downstream level, those corporate decisions, those policies, and those politics are very, very high upstream. They're impacting those risk factors for use, and they're getting either promoting or preventing the promotion of products at all parts of this cascade.